Turn on the microphone.
2,000 people are working in tech, developers, designers, and everything around this. And we are selling more than 250K. So, I will talk quickly about Styleguide. And the question for us was, why Styleguide? I'm currently working with Zalando, and there we have the setup that we have 6 autonomous teams working in different domains. If you work in retail, you will be surprised how big and complex the whole life cycle of the product you want to sell is, especially depending on what you're selling. Accessories to makeup, all the different things, it depends highly. You have a huge life cycle. For the whole life cycle, we have a lot of tools. And currently, we are trying to develop a couple of new applications to solve a couple of issues we had in the past. Also, we want to update. I guess you're hearing me anyway. Cool. So, style. So in retail, we have to think that each team is working in one domain, which means they're independently working on applications. And therefore, we have 6 teams with different developers working on different applications. And the first thing why we need the Styleguide in our department is really to have the same look and feel. So if you have multiple applications, you want the user experience has to be consistent and cohesive across these applications. You don't want having one user, even internal or external, before we have both, that they have to learn, get trained on every single application. It should be intuitive, it should be easy to learn, and once you learned it, you should learn it again for each application. That's one thing why we need the website guide for us, for our JavaScript applications. And the second thing is an engineering perspective, and this is, we as a front-end developer, we don't want to repeat ourselves. Meaning that in the web world, we are these days developing everything in components, and we can develop our styles with CSS or SCSS or whatever. And once we have the style guide with all the basic design language items, then you don't really repeat a couple of common things. Like you don't style your buttons again and again. You just do it once, and everyone else can just pick up the styling. And in our case, even pick up some patterns. We have also some complex components, which developers can just use instead of developing multiple times. So we can work on other topics and focus on other things instead of. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So that's the second thing. Hi again. And the third thing for every one of us, which we already learned, is that we can move fast. As we are developing a lot of applications, we have a lot of assumptions. So we start small, having small MVPs or even prototypes, just to check if the design we have really fits in what the user expects. And with a style guide, we can move quite fast. Like before that, we had maybe weeks working on things. Now we have like maybe days developing a first prototype with an existing style, so users already know how to work with it instead of learning a new thing or having just a simple Google Forms or mockup. Here we can really have a clear UI users can work with, mocked with data, so we can really get good feedback on the assumptions we have from the product. So these were the 3 things why we need the style guide, and then we had a lot more requirements. So in our setup, it was also like, how can we all contribute to the style guide? Meaning that we don't have only front-end developers contributing to this. We also had the interest of UX designers who are developing the whole design language, who was also interested, they were also interested in contributing to the documentation on that side. And so we need a setup where it's easy for the UX designers and easy for front-end developers, and on top maybe even for anyone else. Our assumption was like, whoever wants to contribute, the initial gap should be like small. The learning curve should be small instead of like a huge setup. Therefore, I clustered our requirements a bit into easy to maintain. We already had one style guide approach in the past where we had the issue that it was a static site generator. It was a bit hard to configure. And whenever we wanted to update the documentation, we had to do it manually because of the way the static site generator in that case worked. And also the tool we used, which was an open source tool, it was called Fabricator. It is now deprecated. Like 1.5 years ago it was deprecated. So it was even harder working on it. So we had really the need to have something which is easy to maintain, even with maybe almost no maintenance costs for us, rather than having in one application we develop anyway. So this means also we wanted something which is integrating quite well in our existing developer workflow with GitHub. Because internally we use GitHub Enterprise, and if we open source, we also do it on github.com. So everyone as a developer knows GitHub quite well, and the whole ecosystem around. So we wanted a solution which fits good into this day-to-day workflow. The second thing is easy to contribute, as I said. So again, UX designers and also developers should be able to contribute without having a huge complex setup, maybe even not much of a setup anyway. Then, easy to customize. Here's the thing with static site generators, or sometimes even with more complex content management systems for documentation, especially for us. If you're developing front-end application, you work with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That's your basic technologies you use. But often, with any management system, you end up having template engines, new languages on top, maybe even frameworks or libraries on top of it, which you have to learn to create your own style, your own template. It's not really complex for a developer to catch up, but we quite often had the issue in the past that at one point you have maybe a feature you want to implement in your own Styleguide application which the engine doesn't support, so you have hacky solutions, you have to go deep into the source code maybe to understand, or maybe even extend the rendering engine, instead of just using what we use anyway, HTML and CSS. So here we also wanted to have a solution which could fit maybe into our current approach in just developing maybe even a single page application and having APIs which provides us something, the documentation content, for example. And the last one is already a solution, but we also had as a requirement, it is we wanted to use Markdown. So in our setup, all UX designers and all front-end developers, we all agreed on the fact that Markdown is a nice thing to use for documenting stuff. Especially it's easy to catch up the syntax and it's easy to use, and there are a lot of libraries for rendering, parsing Markdown. And now comes the solution. Solution number one, the basic workflow is, if you're working with GitHub Enterprise, it's basically a common pull request workflow we have on GitHub. So we have a developer or a UX designer. They create a pull request for code or for their documentation, which is the Markdown file, in one of these repositories. It's either in the SCSS repository or the components. Here was one decision we made to enable also developers to do their documentations as fast as possible, because often most developers complain of switching to another repository, to another interface. And here we said, okay, if you develop the feature in the repository, it's just another subfolder for the documentation. So you can also update the documentation immediately instead of switching the context maybe, got distracted, and then maybe 2 days later you have to document the feature you worked on and you already lost half of your decisions. And once it's merged, the whole process of getting to the Styleguide application is automated with our CI solution, which is, in this case, it's Circle CI. And we test everything. We build the whole Styleguide application, which is a single page application, because we also wanted that kind of approach. So we have full autonomy in the technologies we use, in the decisions we make, in the conventions we create on our own, instead of relying on others, because they kind of limit us in the past. So whenever there is a pull request merged, we immediately deploy the new Styleguide application. For us, it was important that the state of the library, the repositories, should be mirrored immediately in the Styleguide application, so instead of having different forks and different states. The only review process we have here is really the pull request. Whenever you have a pull request, developers, designers, they sit together and check if the documentation is updated, if it makes sense, if it's working, if the markdown is correctly written, if there is maybe like, instead of a bigger headline, you use a smaller headline, these kind of small things. And we all check them together. And the other thing is, I go a bit more into the detail for each repository is, as I said, we have UX designers who contribute to every repository. And we also had, for us it was really good that we also had now one UX designer contributing also to SCSS code. So they also had the interest to contribute to the code because they have these nice UI toolings like Sketch, and they can generate their SAS code out of it. And it will also make sense for us because they have this design, they generate their SCSS, and then it was more having code consistency across developers and the UX designers, that the whole code looks like one developer has written it. So there is a nice open source tool which is called Stylint, which is basically linting your SCSS, CSS or something. I can recommend it. It's easy to set up. This is just the setup file. The good thing is there are even existing guidelines you can just use and extend, or even just with a two-liner you can just use the existing guideline, and then they will lint it. They will lint the whole project for you. And the other thing is that for each pull request we also lint again. So we lint the SAS code, and then we also build one time to see if it's really building up. Because linting is one thing, but if it's really successfully building is the other part. And again, documentation is also done here just as markdown files. And the other interesting thing is, if we work in the front end space, or you maybe worked or read something about this, people are developing a lot in components. In our case, we develop in React. Which means that it's quite nice to just develop small components. And it's also even better to document them. Because there are existing standards, or open source standards, also in the JavaScript world. One is JS docs, which is kind of the same like Java docs, kind of. There might be some differences, but it's like inspired from it. And, oh, you can't see it really, but if you could see it, here's a description in your comment of the component, like what the component is really doing. Let's say you have a header component with a login. Maybe you want to provide links to different navigation items. Here's a short description. Here is basically, if a React component, the React component is just a black box for the user. And you can just throw in some data into it, and you expect as an output an HTML item, like an element, a DOM items. So and here, for example, for our components, we documented all the properties, they call it properties, one component expects or wants from you or supports. So, and here is another example, because this one is big. Again, description, property. The nice thing again about Markdown is you could even provide in the code some examples, how you would use the component in your own code with the example flag tag. And with this nice open source library called documentation.js, you can generate from your JS docs the Markdown, which means the developer in his normal day-to-day work, he's just developing the component, providing us this documentation, and this creates the Markdown for us. So the developer doesn't have to do anything. This is also part of the CI process. So we create also these API documentations for our components from the comments. And thanks to the whole CI, continuous integration and continuous deployment strategy we have, whenever you just create a new feature and you push it, everything else is automatically generated for you. So it's, as I said, it's easy to maintain for the developer, because basically you just don't really care. Once it's set up, it's working, it's currently working, you just develop your components, your features for the style guide, and you don't care really how everything else is built up. And this is a screenshot how it looks like. It's our own design, so we kind of also dog feeding the style guide with our SCSS library and everything, so we can even test if everything is working. And then here, this is the basic documentation we still have to do manually. And let's say we have this API documentation for the component, and this is also generated automatically. And everything is bundled into this JavaScript application. So that even, it's a nice side effect, because we bundle everything already, even the Markdown is a JavaScript object already. This is even offline. Like, you could even, if you don't have any internet connection, you can still use this application because everything is already there. It's a static site. So we don't even do any API calls anymore. It's just getting the basic JavaScript files, the styling, and then we are done. Conclusion. Documentation as important as code. When we started this, we had some tough discussion. We already had before the talk. It's about some developers, they think just my code is a single source of truth. So if you don't understand my code, then you will also not understand maybe the documentation, so I don't do it anyway. It's needless time, I don't have to do it, why should I do it? Just learn to read my code. But we had some tough discussions and we decided that the documentation is like a first-class citizen. It's as important for the pull request as your code. If there is no documentation, the pull request got rejected. In our case, if you use GitHub, you can provide pull request templates, and there you can provide checklists. And one of the checklist items is also, do you have any updated feature or something? Please update your documentation, otherwise it gets rejected. So if there is no documentation, we don't merge it. At the beginning it was hard for all the developers, but currently everyone is fine, everyone is accepting this approach, and now we also see the benefits because now everything is documented. If we have new joiners, they can use the library quite fast. It's easy to onboard new people instead of having this knowledge silos where you have to maybe ask each person individually who developed which component. And another thing is keep entry level low, which was for us. Basically, if you want to contribute, you just need to know Markdown. Yes, you also need to know a bit GitHub, like for example our UX designers. They never used GitHub before, so we had a small training session with them. But thanks to GitHub in that case, they have this nice desktop application, so it was even easy for them to understand the basic thing like, okay, I need to create a branch, I need to do my stuff, and then I create the pull request, and that's it for them. And currently it's also working pretty well because most of the general documentation about why we choose this behavior and why this thing is, yeah, we're almost done. So use documentation.js. I can really recommend it if you have a JavaScript project. It's really helpful because if you have your Markdown generated, you can have two things. One, in your application, or the second thing is, if you have a GitHub repository, it's already rendered so people can immediately see your documentation, which is also a nice side effect for us. And the last thing is, this approach kind of, I think these days it's called something like Jamstack, which is JavaScript, APIs, and Markdown. So you basically use GitHub, you use JavaScript as much as possible, and maybe you have additional APIs for additional things. One popular page is Smashing Magazines, if you know this developer page. They are fully into the Jamstack approach. And there are also like big companies kind of like Netlify who are allowing this. Thanks everyone. If you are interested, I have a demo project currently. Oh, sorry, you can applaud, it's fine. You can see it anyway. Yeah.
We have a very tight schedule, so questions outside the door. I think.
Yeah.
Thank you for navigating all the trouble.
That's fine.
And